When you hear the words International Monetary Fund, what actually comes to your mind? Stability, rescue, global cooperation, or something far more uncomfortable? Because in 2023 alone, developing nations paid $1.4 trillion, not to build schools, not to expand hospitals, not to develop infrastructure, but just to service interest on foreign debt. Not the debt itself, just the interest. That single number exposes one of the most powerful and least questioned systems in the modern world. We're often told the IMF exists is a financial firefighter, stepping in when countries are on the brink, restoring stability, and helping economies recover. But history tells a very different story, a story where debt never really ends, where aid flows in, but far more wealth flows out, where sovereignty is quietly exchanged for survival. For me, whenever the IMF is mentioned, that $1.4 trillion figure keeps repeating in my head. That money didn't reduce debt. It didn't buy freedom. It simply vanished into the financial centers of Washington, London, and Paris. Yes, when loans are taken, repayments are expected. But this system goes far beyond simple repayment. For every single dollar of aid sent to the global south, $14 leave through underpriced exports, overpriced imports, and profits taken home by foreign investors. Over the last 60 years, more than $62 trillion has been extracted from poor and developing nations and absorbed into banks and corporations in wealthy countries. At the center of this system stands the International Monetary Fund. We were told the IMF was a last resort lifeline. Instead, many nations found themselves locked into austerity programs, forced to trade sovereignty for survival. According to the United Nations, the developing world now carries $31 trillion in debt. Compared to the United States' $38 trillion, that number doesn't sound extreme. Until you understand the difference, the U.S. controls the world's reserve currency. Developing nations don't. They never get a pause. No matter how many reforms they implement or how much aid they receive, debt becomes harder to manage, and daily life becomes more difficult for ordinary people. Today, nearly 60% of low-income countries are in debt distress. Many governments now spend more money paying interest than they do on actual development, and the pattern keeps repeating. A country runs out of money, the IMF steps in, stability is promised, a loan is offered, and with every loan comes a detailed manual on how that country must run its economy. When researchers examined the results, the numbers told a darker story. Independent evaluations found that countries under IMF programs consistently underperformed. In the very first year alone, growth fell 1.5 percentage points below IMF projections. That's not a minor forecasting error. That's an entire economy slowing down when it was supposed to recover. The balance of power inside the IMF explains why. Out of nearly 190 member states, one country, the United States, holds veto power over major decisions. The global north controls 9 times more voting power than the global south combined. Officially, it's a global institution. In practice, it's a boardroom dominated by the world's richest economies. Colonialism didn't disappear. It evolved. Today, control isn't enforced with armies. It's enforced with debt, interest rates, and economic policies written thousands of miles away. To understand how this happened, we need to go back. Between 1945 and 1960, dozens of countries across Asia and Africa gained independence. But freedom on paper didn't undo centuries of extraction. Borders were arbitrarily drawn. Rivals were forced together. Economies were hollowed out. There was no industry, no infrastructure, and no access to capital. Colonial powers often claim they invested in development. What they leave out is that railways and roads led almost exclusively to ports, designed not to strengthen economies but to extract resources more efficiently. When independence finally came, what remained was debt and division. So newly independent nations did what any desperate country would do. They borrowed. And that's where the IMF entered the picture. The IMF was founded in 1944 at the Bretton Woods Conference, alongside the World Bank. Its mission was to prevent future global collapses and stabilize the post-war economy. It was meant to provide short-term loans, giving countries time to recover. Temporary help, however, has a way of becoming permanent. By the 1970s, oil shocks and financial turmoil pushed developing countries into massive borrowing. By the 1980s, those debts had spiraled out of control. What started as liquidity problems turned into full-scale debt crises. The IMF responded with a new approach: structural adjustment programs, reforms that promised stability but delivered dependence. Countries were told to devalue their currencies, slash public spending, privatize state assets, and open markets overnight. Governments stopped budgeting for their citizens and started budgeting for IMF approval. On paper, economies showed growth. In reality, factories closed, jobs disappeared, and the local industries collapsed under cheap imports. Exports rose, but mostly in raw materials. Profits flowed outward. A small elite benefited, while the majority paid the price. When criticism grew, the IMF didn't abandon the model. It rebranded it. Structural adjustment became conditionality, a technical word for the same control. Loans were released in installments, miss a target, and funding froze. Governments had no leverage. Public services were the first to be cut. Healthcare, education, pensions, and social safety nets were reshaped for repayment, not public well-being. Inequality widened, poverty spread. Entire generations grew up under austerity. Take Zambia as an example. Between 2018 and 2021, debt repayments jumped from 20% to 38% of the national budget. Healthcare funding fell. Education spending dropped sharply. Debt came first. People came last. Nowhere were these effects more devastating than in Africa. After decades of IMF-backed reforms, Africa's share of global exports collapsed. Manufacturing declined. Investment dried up. Nearly $88.6 billion leaves the continent every year through capital flight, almost 4% of GDP. That loss forces governments to borrow even more. The trap tightens. Once the system proved profitable, it didn't stay confined to the global south. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, the same IMF playbook was applied to Russia under the name shock therapy. Industries were sold overnight, prices exploded, savings vanished, factories closed, life expectancy dropped. Out of the ruins, oligarchs emerged, buying national wealth for pennies. Russia had everything it needed to rebuild. Shock therapy turned strength into weakness. The same story played out in Zambia, in Argentina, and across multiple continents. Different countries, same formula. The IMF is often described as a global safety net, but history shows it functions as part of a larger system designed to protect the interests of the most powerful nations on Earth. So when the IMF talks about reform and stability, we have to ask ourselves a serious question. Is it really about saving economies, or is it about protecting the power of those who already control them? If you made it this far, drop a comment. I want to see who stayed till the end.